Oh, I could tell you why. All right. I'm going to try not to strike out on this one. How many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz? Yes. There are some hands that didn't go up. Really? Now, most of you know, because I talk about The Wizard of Oz on occasion, and you know that as a child, this was not my favorite movie. This movie scared me to death. See, the Wicked Witch, the flying monkeys, something about it just really, really scared me as a child. And when I would have nightmares as a child, I would have nightmares about The Wizard of Oz. Not about Nightmare on Elm Street or anything you might think would actually be a scary movie. But The Wizard of Oz really got me. And I think I may have shared this before, but I remember when the actress that played the witch passed away, and I experienced a little bit of joy as a child at her passing. And my mother came down on me. She's like, she was just an actress. I'm like, yeah, but ding dong, the Wicked Witch is dead, Like, I couldn't help it because she instilled such fear in me as a child that my visceral gut reaction at her passing was I really did feel as though something wicked had passed. Even though now as an adult, I realized that she's just an actress, just doing her role, playing her part. But The Wizard of Oz has had a huge influence on American culture. If you grew up in America, it would be played basically once a year, right around, I think it's like Thanksgiving or Christmas time, sometime in the holiday season, and they would broadcast it one time every year. And my parents would always watch it. And so I always had to watch it, and every year, tormented for weeks afterwards by the Wicked Witch and the Flying Monkeys. But there are some characters in The Wizard of Oz that I appreciate. One of them is this guy, the Scarecrow. Right? He always wished he had he wished he had a brain, right? Right? Maybe we need to watch Wizard of Oz here at church one more time. You guys get a little sketchy on me. Right? He wished he had a brain. He's like, if I only had a brain. And all these things he could do. Well, I could tell you why the ocean meets the shore. Like, he could tell you all these things. Everything would be better if only he had a brain, right? Or a heart. Oh, the Tin Man could do so many wonderful things if only he had a heart. Or my favorite one, the Noive. I've always wanted to do that in a sermon. The Noive. If he had the nerve, if he had courage, right? If he had the courage, and the actors, they didn't tell him to lose their accents, the Bostonian accent, just keep the accent. It made the movie kind of endearing to hear people dressed up in this fantasy world speaking with Bostonian accents. He had the Noive. Put him up. Sometimes that's how we are too, if only. We kind of live in this if only world. If only I had this, if only I had that. How many of you know what the Powerball lottery is up to now? If only I had $1 billion, then I could finally start to enjoy life. Hopefully it'll last me. Hopefully it'll last me the rest of my life, but you never know. Right? We have this idea, if only I had this, if only I had that. And we're not alone in this. This is a human problem. It's a problem that even the Israelites had, is the if only problem. They said, if we only had a king. If we only had a king. Oh, they could tell you why. And they could tell you how they would meet their challenges. And they could tell you and meet warriors from opposing countries on the battlefield if they only had a king. They could tell you what would happen if they only had a king, because up to this point they didn't. They had, each tribe had a judge or a leader, and these leaders would rise and they'd fall, and they would sometimes perform well and sometimes they wouldn't perform well, and it's just up and down they'd go. And opposing countries or areas would attack them. They didn't have a military force to oppose them with because they were just these individual smaller tribes. And if only we had a king, that would solve all of our problems. I think you can relate to that idea. If only. Judges 17, actually near the end of the book of Judges, almost every chapter from here to the end will say this phrase, or part of this phrase: in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And the idea was, if we had a king, well, we would all line up. We would all agree on what was supposed to be done next. If we only had a king. Otherwise, everyone's just doing whatever they see fit in their own eyes. Now, I will tell you, if you are easily triggered by things that happen within history that are awful, do not read Judges 17 and following, because you will find awful, awful stories of murder and rape and dismemberment and attacking people and taking their wives and giving the women from that other tribe to this other tribe over here so they can have what? It's an awful, awful part of Israelite history. That the author of Judges thought, if we only had a king, we could overcome this. It says again in chapter 18, in those days Israel had no king, and he goes on to tell you some awful story that sounds just like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Almost identical in every way. Judges 18, but that wouldn't have happened if only we'd had a king. Or Judges 19, in those days they had no king, and he proceeds to tell you some other awful story of something that happened that wouldn't have happened if they'd had a king. Or Judges 21, near the end of the book. The way to end it off in Judges is to say, if only we'd had a king. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It's kind of almost like this idealized picture of what will happen if we can all just gather together under one leader. Now, we live in America. We go through a whole different process to pick our leaders. But one thing we can all agree on is just because we have a leader doesn't mean we've all lined up under the leader. Not so simple. We know that there are complications involved in saying, well, if we just had a leader. And America said, no, we'll do better. If we all had a leader that we got to pick, then we would all, can you imagine the good that can be done? If only we had a king, if only we had just a single leader, if only we had our guy. Then we could tell you why the ocean meets the shore. Then we could do all these wonderful things. But there are complications with having a king. Some of those complications are told to us within Scripture itself. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now Samuel is the last judge, prophet, priest combination that we have. He's the last judge that we have, and he has a story, interesting story of his own of how he came to be in his birth and his mother and the prayers and the temple and all those things that are the tabernacle and all those things that are happening. But at some point near the end of his life, we read about this. It says, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served in Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. We don't know any leaders like that around here. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. You can only imagine what they want to do when they have been handed over horrible leaders. Now Samuel may have been a great prophet, priest, judge, but he appears not to have been a great father, because his children didn't follow him at all. Now, I can tell you as a father, there are some things that I do that my children do, and I go, oh no, wish they had not followed in my footsteps. But there they are, following along anyway. His children did not follow in his footsteps. They took bribes, perverted justice. If you wanted to have justice done, all you had to do was pay them a little more than the other guy was willing to pay, and your version of justice would be done, whether it was actually just or not. And so all the people come together. They're tired of it. They're tired of enemies coming against them, and they don't have a military. They're tired of going to their rulers and their rulers being unjust, and they just want to fix all their problems. So they make a request. They said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." So they make the request. If we only had a king, give us a king. What they don't realize is they already have a king. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue here. Understanding this story is going to help you understand the Gospel of John. Now, I know that might seem like at this point that that's coming out of nowhere. We're going to look at the Gospel of John in just a second. But understanding this story and this theme of rejecting God as king is all throughout the Gospel of John. And so God tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you as their leader, and they're not rejecting your sons as they're rejecting me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. So he says, give them what they want, but make sure they know what they're asking for first. There are some things in my life I wish someone had told me first what I was asking for before I got it. To warn them and tell them this is what's going to happen if they get what it is they say they want. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what a king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots." In other words, do you know what it is you're asking for? Do you want a military? You want a king to form a military? Do you know what that's going to look like? It's going to be comprised of your sons. He's going to conscript them. He's going to make them be a part of the military. Do you want that for your children? Just so you know what you're asking for. He's going to make some of them slaves working in fields and growing crops, maybe so that the soldiers that are been conscripted to war will have food to eat. They can have reserves for their soldiers. I don't know, but they're going to be slaves in a field working if you reject God as king. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. Are you sure you want to reject God as king? He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Okay, so the picture's been painted. It's pretty bleak, right? If God gives you what it is you want, things aren't going to be as good as you think they're going to be. Some of what's described here is what Solomon does. It's what he does. He conscripts labor from the north, and he makes each tribe in the north, actually the tribes redistricted, but whatever. He takes these groups that he had formed in the north, and he has them come and serve and bring food for him down in Jerusalem, him and his people. Just like Samuel said, this is going to happen. Is that what you want? And you know from their history, they decide it's not what we want. Because when Solomon dies, all the people from the north come and say, your father was a tyrant. If you're being nicer than him, we'll get along just fine. And Solomon's son says, no, that's not going to happen. I'm going to be worse than Dad. It's not what they wanted at all. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us. and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all the people said, he repeated it before the Lord, and the Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. And so that is what he does. Now I could do what Ignacio said. I could spend until midnight going through all the kings that Israel and Judah ever had. But we're not going to do that. One, because I couldn't name all the kings they ever had to begin with. So he picks Saul and it falls apart. And then David takes over. And there's all kinds of turmoil and struggle within the kingdom of David. And then Solomon finally rises up. And that all falls apart when he dies. And the nation is split in two. Then one nation gets completely wiped out. And then the next nation below them, which is Judah, they get completely wiped out. And everything is a mess. Turns out having a king wasn't really all that great after all. It didn't solve all their problems the way they thought it would. There were a lot of complications with having a king. Throughout the Gospel of John, there is this idea and this concept of, you'll remember some of the conversations perhaps we've had already. We are sons of Abraham. We are disciples of Moses. The only father we have is God. But we see a different story through the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John starts out in chapter 1 and says, he came into his own, and his own did not receive him. This is the story of God's life with his people. He came into his own did not receive him. And when Jesus comes into his own again, his own still will not receive him. Jesus has been arrested. He's before Pilate, and says Pilate went back inside. Everyone's in turmoil. They're all crying out for Jesus to be crucified. And he goes back in the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says yes and no. If by king you mean a king like all the other nations have, then the answer is no. I'm not that kind of king. All the things that Samuel said a king would do, Jesus says that's not me. If your definition of king is that, then I'm not a king. But if your definition of king is someone, as Ignacio says, someone who will serve, and someone who will love, and someone who will give his life for his people, someone who will have his people not fighting in a war. Do you see? Jesus does not conscript his disciples to be his soldiers. If that's your definition of king, then yes. Yes, in fact, I am. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. I'm not like the other nations. If it were, my servants would fight. Why? Because I would have conscripted them to fight on my behalf. But as it is, my kingdom is from another place. And Jesus sets himself up as a different kind of king. And as before, there was one verse as I was studying through John that jumped out that motivated me to go back. And you'll see it in a bit. I think Kathy already knows which one it is. She got a big smile on her face when I said that. Will I surprise you? Probably not. Pilate replies, what is truth? With this he went out again to the Jews, gathered there, and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. He's not the kind of king a kingdom like us worries about. He has no army. He has no one around to support him. We're not too concerned. We here in Rome, we're not worried about Jesus. We don't find any charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? Then Pilate took Jesus, had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they slapped him in the face. There's a verse It's not the verse I was referring to, and I hadn't planned on mentioning it, but I think it's important. When he asked, hey, normally at Passover, I will release a prisoner to you. Should I release the king of the Jews? And they'll say, he's not our king. Or he'll say, should I release Barabbas? And they say, release to us Barabbas. Barabbas' name, Bar means son of, Abbas means father. So Pilate asked them, should I release to you the son of the father, or should I release to you the son of the father? The king of the Jews or the son of the father? And they say, release to us Barabbas. The one who actually was involved in an insurrection. The one who actually did want to rise up against Rome. Release him to us. And so Pilate does. And he has Jesus flogged, and they make fun of him, and they say, hail, King of the Jews, and they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Who is Caesar? He's a king like every other nation has. Who is Jesus? He is a king like no other nation has. And so they returned the threat back to Pilate. If you don't release him, you are setting free a king, a self-proclaimed king. And how could a friend of the true king ever do such a thing? We'll report you, and you will be in trouble for what you've done, Pilate. You won't be a friend of Caesar at this point. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, take him away. Crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. And this is the verse that jumped out at me. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Throughout their history, they always wanted a king. And God says, they're rejecting me as their king. 1,000 years later, we see history repeat itself. We see history repeat itself. God comes again as their king, but his own will not receive him. They reject him. And they say, we have no king but Caesar. And the question I want to ask this morning is, who is your king? Who is your king? Jesus says things like, I'm the true shepherd. And he actually makes a reference to this passage in John chapter 18 and 19. He says, I'm the true shepherd. My sheep, they hear my voice. And when I call for them, they come to me. Who is your shepherd? Whose voice do you listen to? Who do you want to have lead your life? It's Jesus. When Jesus tells us things like, love your enemies, is Jesus our king? When Jesus says things like, If someone slaps you on the cheek, give them the other cheek as well. I don't know if I ever shared this story about my Uncle Gary. He was always ornery. And he would sometimes at church walk up to people at church and slap them on the face and then say, "What are you going to do about it, Christian?" Just to see if they would actually turn the other cheek. Now, he wouldn't hit them hard, but hard enough. He wouldn't do it like a love tap either. He'd get them, okay, good. They'd remember it. And so I thought one day in college, I'm going to do that with my friend Brian. And so I did. I walked up and I smacked him. And he got irritated at first. I go, "What are you going to do about it, Christian?" And he just sat there. To his credit, he didn't slap me back. I totally would have had it coming too. Unlike my uncle, I'm not as fast. He probably would have got me. Who is our king? Whose voice do we hear call out and we follow that voice? For Israel, they had rejected God as king. And in that passage, God says, they've been rejecting me as king since I brought them out of Egypt. And we find out when Jesus comes, they're still rejecting him as king. Because as it turns out, what they think they really want is a king like everyone else. No king but Caesar. And sometimes I feel like as people, when we think about leadership and we think about government, we think about all those things, we tend to kind of separate church and state because that's what we were trained to do from our birth, basically, here in this country. And in our minds, we do, but we look at a president and we say we want a president like everyone else, but we want a God that's different. And we put so much faith and so much stock in our human systems. But whose voice do you listen to when your favorite political party leader says one thing, but Scripture says something else? Who do you listen to? Who do you listen to? Whose example do you follow? What is it you really want? Right? Back to the if only. What is it you really want? So here's what I say, take it for what it's worth. Human leaders are human leaders. That's all we are. That's it. That's all we'll ever be as a human leader. We come and we go. Different systems of government, they come and they go. Different nations rise and they fall. And that's the way it will always be. But there's only one kingdom that doesn't rise and fall, and that's the kingdom of God. And we have a different set of rules, so to speak, that we live by. And they are not the rules of this world. They're not of this world at all. If they were of this world, you would see Jesus telling us to act like everyone else and do things just like everyone else. His disciples would have been there with swords trying to free him from his captivity from Rome, but they weren't there because he didn't teach them to do that. How many things do we do in our lives that Jesus never taught us to do that? Whose voice are we listening to? Who really is our King? Ignacio, if you want to come up and lead us in a final song, we'll all go ahead and be standing. Who is your King?